Okay, so we are now at our final talk, our final presentation as part of the International Desert Conservation Summit. I think that you'll agree with me that there's been a lot of common themes through the work that we've been talking about today, that our presenters have been discussing: alternative livelihoods, sustainable livelihoods, community engagement, stakeholder engagement, the importance of education, working with the communities to make certain that they're a core part of the project. And I think our final video, or not even video, excuse me, our final live talk, our only live talk that we will have is with Vincent James. And Vince is a fish and wildlife biologist specializing on desert tortoise. He's based out of the Coachella Valley here, just up the road in Palm Springs with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And he is going to speak about the Mojave Desert tortoise recovery efforts in Southern California, a community effort. And there we are, Vince. Hello, my friend.
Hello. Thanks, James, for that great introduction. And good afternoon, everybody. As James said, my name is Vincent James, and I'm a wildlife biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'll just kind of mention that my PowerPoint is set up a bit more formal, but I will do my best to be as engaging as possible for everybody. I'm definitely excited to be able to present our conservation work for all of you today, and special thanks to the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens for putting this great conservation summit together. So let me share my screen and we can get started. So as James mentioned, the title of my presentation is Recovery Efforts and Conservation Partnerships for the Mojave Desert Tortoise in Southern California. And the overall purpose of my presentation is to discuss desert tortoise recovery actions and highlight our conservation partnerships to achieve our recovery goals. First, I'll give you a little background about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, excuse me, and then I'll talk about Mojave Desert Tortoise and its recovery plan, which describes the threats and recovery actions to help save this federally protected species. At the end, I will describe some of our education, public outreach and recovery actions by highlighting some of our conservation partnerships, which includes the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens and a public outreach event called Desert Tortoise Week. So the mission of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. Our vision is that we will continue to be a leader and trusted partners in the fish and wildlife conservation, known for our scientific excellence, stewardship of lands and natural resources, dedicated professionals, and commitment to public service. And one of my responsibilities as a wildlife biologist for the service is to implement the Endangered Species Act to protect federally listed plants and wildlife, specifically in Southern California within desert ecosystems. So the Mojave Desert Tortoise was listed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on April 2nd, 1990, because of the direct losses and threats to tortoise populations and habitat. Desert tortoises live in the Mojave Desert and can persist in a range of different habitats that include sandy flats, rocky foothills, alluvial fans, desert washes, and desert canyons. Tortoises can generally live up to 50 to 80 years and enjoy eating native herbs, grasses, cacti, and wildflowers, like this brown-eyed primrose shown below. Tortoises reach sexual maturity around the age of 15 and begin looking for mates between August through October, just depending on weather conditions. Once a desert tortoise is ready to reproduce, a female can lay up to 3 clutches a season, with each clutch consisting of about 1 to 14 eggs. And then it generally takes about 90 to 120 days for these eggs to hatch, producing these very cute little juvenile tortoises, as you can see in the photo. And so here we have a map of the range of Mojave Desert Tortoise. The hatched area represents the range of the Mojave Desert Tortoise, whereas the stippling represents the range of the Sonoran Desert Tortoise. These two distinct species of tortoises are separated by the Colorado River. So in 1994, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published the Desert Tortoise Recovery Plan that described the threats and specific recovery actions needed to help this species survive. Since then, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has learned a lot about the species and revised our recovery plan in 2011, incorporating the best available science to help our recovery efforts for this species. So in order to achieve our recovery goals, the plan described a process to develop recovery implementation teams. These recovery implementation teams are led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and consist of a number of federal, state, and local government agencies, as well as non-governmental organizations, which include environmental groups and nonprofit organizations. We have three groups: the Upper Virgin River, the Northeast Mojave, and the California Mojave Recovery Implementation Teams. In California, the Recovery Implementation Team is comprised of three major work groups, and I'm the point of contact, the lead for the Colorado Desert Work Group, and you can see that is the southeastern boundary of the range of the desert tortoise. So the reason for the recovery plan is to address these threats to desert tortoises. And so here we have just a few of the threats that we try to minimize pressure from on this species. So habitat loss. Desert tortoise habitat is being lost to human developments, such as these large-scale solar renewable energy projects that can range between 2,000 to 4,000 acres. Non-native invasive plants is another threat to desert tortoise habitat. These plants can outcompete our native wildflowers and reduce the quality of desert tortoise foraging habitat. The photo in the bottom left-hand corner is a field of pebble pincushion, or Chinactis species, that tortoises enjoy feasting upon. Another major threat is raven predation on juvenile desert tortoises. So when a tortoise hatches, their shells are not fully developed and can be easy prey for these ravens, where they use their sharp beaks to peck through their undeveloped shell. And we're experiencing an increase in raven populations and are trying to figure out ways to minimize the impact of ravens on our juvenile populations of desert tortoises. The last threat is roads and utility corridors. Roads increase the chance of road mortalities, which decrease populations of our desert tortoises. Utility corridors typically have these large structures that are just perfect for ravens to use as tall perches to hunt juvenile desert tortoises. So how exactly do we deal with all of these threats? Well, first we try to restore habitat by removing non-native invasive plants. We also try to target predators and try to control their populations. We also install desert tortoise barrier fencing along roads to minimize the potential for road mortalities. And we also rely on education and public outreach to help inform the public on what they can do to help desert tortoises, as well as other wildlife resources, which is what I'll be focusing on for the remainder of this presentation. So first, I'd like to highlight a conservation partnership with the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service helped fund a program called Time to Talk Trash. This program informs the public that ravens are a major threat to juvenile desert tortoises and advocates that people make sure they pick up their trash and securely cover it to protect it from ravens. As you can see in the bottom left-hand photo, here are a few ravens enjoying someone else's leftovers, and the trash cans do not have lids on them, so the ravens can just enjoy what they want, which is extremely challenging. But another program that the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens has developed is a public outreach program to local off-highway vehicle recreationalists. This program informs OHV users about the potential to run over desert tortoises while they're enjoying our beautiful landscapes. The Living Desert advocates that OHV users be aware of their surroundings, as well as to check under their vehicles for potential desert tortoises. As you can see in the photo in the bottom right-hand corner, during warmer temperatures, desert tortoises are known to seek shady spots to help them cool down, specifically under vehicles. So then the next conservation partnership I would like to highlight is actually a multi-organization conservation effort to educate the public about desert tortoise. In 2019, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service coordinated the first annual Desert Tortoise Week on April 13th through April 22nd. This event was a great way for the public to celebrate this iconic desert species and to encourage people to do good things for desert tortoises. So this 2019 event was primarily focused in Palm Springs and the Coachella Valley area within the Colorado Desert Work Group boundary. And this was kind of definitely a pilot study to see if folks were interested in participating. And so during this campaign, we had a number of conservation partners participate in hosting Desert Tortoise Week events. In the top left-hand photo, we see people lined up outside of the Mojave Desert Land Trust plant nursery so that folks could buy native plants that are beneficial for desert tortoises. And during this event, the Mojave Desert Land Trust sold over 400 plants, which were great for tortoises. And then also in the bottom right-hand photo, the Mojave Desert Land Trust also invited wildlife biologists to give talks to the public and also showed a great educational film called The Tortoise in Peril, which was produced by the California Desert Managers Group. This film describes threats to desert tortoises and what we are doing to help reduce the pressure from these threats. And then in the top right-hand photo, we see the Bureau of Land Management engage local hikers and give guided hikes in the desert tortoise habitat, teaching the hikers what to be aware of while they're enjoying our beautiful deserts. The Bureau of Land Management also hosted a desert tortoise exhibit in which people could come up and learn more about tortoises and also sign conservation pledges stating the next time they're hiking in the desert, they would pick up trash and help keep our deserts clean. And then since Desert Tortoise Week overlapped Earth Day, the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens hosted an Earth Day fair and invited all of our conservation partners to participate. In the bottom right-hand photo, you can see that Joshua Tree National Park had a table set up and they were ready to talk about desert tortoises. And we had a great turnout for that event as well. And then we also hosted a habitat restoration work day. The Bureau of Land Management recruited volunteers to help clean up about 2 acres of desert tortoise habitat. Unfortunately, people do use the desert as a dumping ground, so the BLM and volunteers helped pick up trash from this area to make it more suitable for desert tortoises. In the top left-hand photo, you can see a number of butane aerosol cans that were just dumped at the site. But then in the photo on the right, you can see what we did to help restore the area. And in addition to picking up all of this trash, our volunteers also helped pull any non-native invasive plants from the site as well. And by the end of the day, we ended up filling that entire dumpster you can see on the right. It was a great work day, a lot of sun, a lot of sweat, and it was a great day. So those highlighted the events from Desert Tortoise Week in 2019. And now I want to talk about Desert Tortoise Week for 2020. So hashtag Desert Tortoise Week happened on October 5th through October 11th and covered the entire range of the desert tortoise. We coordinated with our conservation partners in Nevada, Arizona, and in Utah to participate in this public outreach campaign. But we did have to kind of think outside of the box to figure out exactly how we were going to be able to interact with the public due to COVID-19. So we tried to tap into our virtual online resources, such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for our social media outreach. So what we did was the service posted daily facts about desert tortoises, along with great photos of the species for the public to enjoy. People really enjoyed seeing baby tortoises all over the internet. It was fun. We also developed social media challenges, like encouraging the public to hike in desert tortoise habitat and then post a photo on their social media account. And then one of my favorite social media challenges was to encourage people hiking in the desert to take a photo from the perspective of a desert tortoise, it's always fun to change how you view things and just to get out of your comfort zone. And yes, in that middle photo, that is me scooting around like a desert tortoise under a shade structure that was built specifically for desert tortoises. We also hosted live online desert tortoise talks. In the photo to the left, you can see that Anza Borrego State Park in California invited Dr. Jeff Manning to discuss his research on the genetic origins of desert tortoises found in this state park. You can actually still view this video if you search for it on Facebook. And then in the middle two photos, Mojave Desert Land Trust hosted an online native plant sale where folks could purchase native desert plants beneficial to desert tortoises, as well as a virtual lessons module that is a great interactive lesson plan for children of all ages, as well as adults. During the online plant sale, the Mojave Desert Land Trust sold about 900 plants that were all beneficial to desert tortoises. And then finally, the last photo is of a live question and answer panel hosted by the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens, where the zoo invited a number of wildlife biologists to answer frequently asked questions about desert tortoises. We even had a question from someone watching all the way in Scotland. But not all of our Desert Tortoise Week events were virtual. In the photo on the left, Joshua Tree National Park gave daily ranger talks to visitors with the focus being on desert tortoises. And then another exciting in-person event was, another in-person event was one of the most creative events for this year, which was hosted by the Living Desert. The zoo coordinated with a local air museum who wanted to convert their parking lot into a drive-in movie theater experience for the public. So the Living Desert asked to show two films at this drive-in movie theater, one being The Tortoise in Peril, that same educational video that I mentioned earlier, that describes the threats of ravens on desert tortoises, and then Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, which is a movie about ravens terrorizing a small community. It's a great film, so that if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend watching it. So after October 11th, I've been coordinating with our conservation partners to calculate how many people participated in these events. And below you can see two bar graphs. The first one on the left is a bar graph that represents how many people attended in-person events. The blue bar represents 2019, and we had a little over 2,000 people attend our Desert Tortoise Week events. The orange bar represents 2020 and shows that we had about 2,400 people participate. And since we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, I would say that's a pretty good turnout with all things considered. The second bar graph on the right represents total number of social media impressions. And we define social media impressions as the number of times a social media post was viewed, liked, shared, or commented on by a social media account. And so in 2019, represented by the blue bar, we had about 800,000 social media impressions. But then this year in orange, we had about 1.2 million social media impressions. And so overall, I would say that we've been quite successful with our public outreach, both with in-person activities and also on social media. But I'd also like to note that because Desert Tortoise Week was only about a month ago, I'm still collecting data from all of our conservation partners, so these numbers are subject to change. But then the cool thing about these social media posts is that they last for quite some time too. So all of this information is still available if you search #DesertTortoiseWeek. And so we had a lot of great participation from all of our conservation partners, and I would like to thank everyone for their assistance, especially the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuge System, the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, the Mojave Desert Land Trust, and especially to the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens. This event could not have been possible without all of the assistance and support from our conservation partners. And next year, I'm sure we'll have even more conservation partners participate as the event grows larger and more widespread. And lastly, I'm in the planning process for Desert Tortoise Week 2021. I hope to continue doing social media challenges, posting daily tortoise facts, hosting virtual events, and in-person public outreach and activities. So depending on the status of COVID-19, Desert Tortoise Week for 2021 will either occur in April or October. So be on the lookout for hashtag Desert Tortoise Week. And finally, I would like to thank again the Living Desert Zoo and Gardens for hosting this International Desert Conservation Summit and for allowing me to present my conservation partnerships to help with desert tortoise recovery. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vince. That was really fantastic work. You've been such a leader for desert tortoise conservation in so many ways across all of the Southwest, not just in Southern California. So hats off to you, sir.
Thanks, James.
So we've got several questions for you that have come in from our audience that I'd like to ask. An interesting one, you didn't talk much about solar arrays, but you did talk about native vegetation and how important it is for tortoises and the impacts of ravens on populations of tortoises. Let's say I'm representing things here. Are the tortoises not able to survive under solar panel arrays?
So that's an excellent question. And we've actually been attempting a number of research projects to determine whether or not these solar projects can persist and allow tortoises to utilize these solar project areas, essentially. One of the concerns is how these solar panels are impacting the vegetation in this area. The reason for having desert tortoise habitat and foraging habitat for tortoises is that they rely heavily on desert annual plants. And so if there's not enough sun or not enough water, these solar sites might not be able to persist or might not be able to host a number of valuable foraging species for desert tortoises. But we're in the process of trying to do on a smaller scale some research projects and figure out how the two interact, essentially.
Sure. You know, that's interesting. As you were talking about the tortoise, I was thinking, you know, in Tanzania, the giraffe is the state mammal, the national mammal, national animal. And in California, of course, the desert tortoise is our state reptile. Do you think, and this is representative of one of our questions here as well, do you think that that is an approach that could be useful for us as we talk to the public about tortoise conservation? Is there some tie-in? Do you think that national or that state status as the state reptile could be a hook? Could that be a selling point?
Absolutely. I mean, one of our close partners is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and they help us engage with the public. They were pivotal in Desert Tortoise Week. And so engaging the state agencies and emphasizing that this is not just a federally protected species, but that this is a state protected species and it's a state reptile, I think definitely helps get our point across to the public on exactly what they can do when they're out enjoying our deserts, and the next time they think about, you know, eating a candy bar and then throwing the wrapper on the ground, they'll pick it up and pack it out with them. So hopefully we can encourage that type of behavior. We want to effectively change any type of learned behavior to actually get a response from the public.
Right, and that's such an important part of community-based conservation, right? Is identifying the behaviors that we want to change and then making certain that our interventions are actually affecting those and tracking those behaviors.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I like to say that conservation is a social science, as much, if not more, than a biological science.
Very much so.
So along those lines, with respect to the desert tortoise, do you find any significant resistance by the general public as far as outreach by a governmental organization as Fish and Wildlife Service? Are people receptive to messages coming from the Fish and Wildlife Service, or is that a problem? Is that an opportunity?
So that's an excellent question. And from my career working for the service, on a personal level, when I've engaged with the public, everybody's been willing and interested in learning about desert tortoises and what they can do to help. One of the challenges with working with the public is that desert tortoise is not the only wildlife species out here. And as I showed earlier, ravens are intelligent creatures. They're a beautiful animal, and people love to encourage ravens. And so one of the challenges that we have faced with the public is that we have what we call raven subsidies. So these subsidies help increase populations of ravens, and locals will end up feeding and watering ravens because they like having them on their desert landscape.
Hmm.
The problem that we see is that they're adjacent to desert tortoise habitat. And when we go to monitor those tortoises, we will end up finding, tiny juvenile desert tortoise carcasses surrounding whatever perching site that they've been at. And so that's been one of the resistances that we've had, is kind of trying to channel, hey, here's what you're doing, here's the impact that you're having on this other wildlife species. We're not saying to stop doing everything that you're doing, but be cognizant and aware of all of the other surrounding wildlife in your area. But it's a balance, essentially.
It is, yes. There's a sort of an apocryphal story about a nest of ravens that had some gigantic number of baby tortoises underneath it. I don't remember what that number is. Do you know?
I don't, but I do know the most recent incident that I worked with, they found about 20 juvenile carcasses under a raven nest. And that was just from one pair of ravens too. And as you heard earlier, it takes a long time for tortoises to reach sexual maturity, and their clutch sizes are between 1 to 14 eggs. So having that many juvenile desert tortoises dead underneath a raven nest is just kind of, it's very detrimental to the population of tortoises.
Right. So a single pair of ravens could essentially wipe out the entire reproductive output of a female for the year.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
And essentially, we would end up with pockets of kind of depleted desert tortoise areas. And then once those pockets occur, they'll end up separating other populations of desert tortoises. So we don't have any connectivity to help with gene flow, with contact, and all that other. It's very compounding, all of the effects that one threat can actually have. And all the threats that I mentioned earlier, they all compound on one another too. So if you have a solar project that goes in that attracts ravens, and so how do you deal with all of this? It's very complex.
Very complex, yes. So ending on an up note for us. The COVID-19 has been a real challenge for conservationists, as we've heard throughout the entire day today. But most all of the organizations have been really great about coming up with alternatives or ways to even build on their impact or change their impact to make people be more receptive, help people be more receptive to the conservation projects. A question that came in was, with COVID-19 now impacting our daily lives along these lines, do you feel that public outreach and engagement is still a viable way to move forward with helping to conserve desert tortoises?
Absolutely. I really believe that it is, because, as I mentioned, we're attempting to change learned behavior, and you can't just one and done. Even during this global pandemic, if folks are staying indoors, they're spending more time reading, more time educating themselves, is my hope. And you fill social media up with all of this information about conservation, sooner or later something will stick. And the next time that they're out and enjoying the desert, or they're out hiking, they'll think twice, essentially, like, oh, let me go find a desert tortoise, and maybe I can take a photo with it, or maybe get on the ground and take a photo with it. Now, I will also encourage you guys to keep your space, because we don't want to end up disturbing the desert tortoises out in the desert. But still, I think that this is something that needs to keep going on. And even if it's just via virtual or social media, I think it will still have an impact. Maybe it's not a direct impact, but it's definitely in our minds constantly.
Fantastic. Vince, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for your creativity, and thanks for your camaraderie and collaboration. We really appreciate getting to work with you.
Excellent. Me too. Thank you so much, James.
Thanks a lot, Vince.